War is hell. It reaches every hand, from the soldier in the trench to the nurse at his side, from the engineer forging weapons to the families left behind. These are their stories. This is World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. Today's episode, Through the Long Nights. Come, wake up, we must go. Her voice cracked with tension as she roused the children. Rubbing his eyes, 13-year-old Levon sat up. What is it, Mama? She ignored his question and moved to her daughter Zabel. Wake up, honey. She turned back to Levon. You must dress. I have some small bags packed already. They're by the door. She paused. Dress warmly. Where are we going, Mama? He asked. She looked down at her 3-year-old daughter, still fast asleep. I don't know yet. Her mind raced. Would she have to carry Zabel? Maybe. She glanced at her large shawl hanging on a peg. Levon, bring me that shawl. We'll use it to carry your sister on my back. Levon handed her the shawl and she spread it out on the floor. Carefully, she placed Zabel in the center of the cloth and folded the sides around her. She then lifted Zabel onto her back, holding the ends of the shawl tightly. Watch closely. Levon, you may have to do this someday, she instructed, her voice steady despite her anxiety. First, I cross the ends over my chest, she demonstrated, pulling the fabric snugly across her front. Then I bring them under my arms and tie them securely behind me, just below Zabel. Levon nodded, his eyes wide with concern and understanding. Will it hold? It should, she replied, adjusting the knots to ensure they were tight. It's how our ancestors carried their children when they needed their hands free. With Zabel securely tied to her back, she turned to Levon. Now, we must hurry. She watched as he picked up the 2 small packs by the door. She had hastily thrown them together after she received the news and the warning. He moved to open the door, but she stopped him. Let me. She stepped in front of him, moving him away from the door with her left arm. She took a deep breath as she reached for the handle of the door and pulled it inwards. Sticking her head outside, she surveyed her surroundings. It was 2 a.m. There should be no one out at this time, and to her relief, there wasn't. She motioned for Levon to follow, and together they stepped out of their home for the final time. A year ago, Ani and her husband Aram sat in the still darkness of their small home, talking of the war, which was in its infancy. The single lamp on the table flickered, its light casting moving shadows on the walls. Outside, the faint sound of the town at night reached them, the lap of water against the docks, the creak of boats tied for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and then fell silent again. He looked at her from across the candlelit table. There are rumors that the army may need to use my warehouses for storage or as barracks again. Really? She asked. Yes, he smiled, but we will be paid handsomely for it. Why here, though? She asked. She knew why already. It was because their small town of Karayel lay on the Bosphorus Strait, and the Ottoman Empire put a lot of importance on the strait for transporting goods and troops. But she loved to hear him talk, so she asked. We can house troops, grains, weapons, anything the army wishes, he said. And with us being on the strait, the government can move it all pretty easily, same as we did a few years ago. He leaned back in his chair and ran a thumb across the ledger that always sat nearby. Those times taught me that the state may stretch us thin, but it pays its debts eventually. Ani smiled faintly, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered the winter of the Balkan Wars, the smell of smoke from the barracks, soldiers trudging through the streets with their boots coated in frozen mud, the sound of coughing that carried through the thin walls at night. It had been a hard season, one that seemed to stain the air long after the snow melted. Outside, the town was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. The talk of war had settled into daily life, turning every market conversation into speculation. Some men spoke of victory with pride, others with worry. Turkish, Greek, and Armenian families shared the same streets, yet no longer the same confidence. Every new order from Constantinople seemed to draw invisible lines between neighbors. Aram drummed his fingers lightly on the table. The world will change again, Ani, but business always finds a way. She looked at him, at the man who always found reason when the world seemed to lose it. The candle trembled as the wind pressed against the shutters. You think the fighting will reach us? She asked. Aram glanced toward the window as if the question might have an answer waiting outside. Not here, he said. The Russians are far to the east, and the army will hold them. What we'll feel is their shadow, nothing more. Ani traced the rim of her cup. Still, the shadow can be cold, she said. He smiled faintly. It passes, he told her. It always does. Through the window came the slow rumble of cartwheels from the quay. Soldiers had begun to patrol more often now, young men with new rifles and uncertain eyes. Ani watched their shadows slide across the far wall as the light from their lanterns swung past. They say the Russians are advancing in the east, she said. Rumors travel faster than armies, he replied, smiling again, though this time it seemed forced. By morning, those same men will be drinking coffee and arguing about whose cousin was called to serve. Life will go on. She nodded, though she was not sure she believed him. She reached across the table and touched the ledger with her fingertips. You should get some sleep, she said. In a moment, he said. I need to finish these numbers before the candle burns out. Numbers can wait, she said. The world will not. Aram closed the book slowly. You're right. Let's go to bed. The weather had turned and was even colder than just a week ago, a sure sign that winter was approaching. She walked along the cobble street, which was flanked on one side by the ocean and market stalls on the other. Levon and Zabel walked with her, both bundled in heavy wool jackets. By now, she was oblivious to the salt smell that the wind carried in from the sea and of the gulls overhead that cawed incessantly. She looked forward to her weekly day at the market. This was the day in which she could catch up on all of the gossip and war news that had spread through the town the prior week. She could do without the cold, but in Carayal the cold came as part of the deal. She knew this. Can I watch the fishermen again, Mama? Asked Levon. He asked this week after week, and she never said no. Of course, take your sister, but be careful, don't let her fall in the water. Another statement made week after week. She watched and smiled as he took her small mittened hand and led her to a bench near the dock where they climbed up and stood to watch the fishermen unload their morning catch. She turned towards the market stalls. Merchants were setting out baskets of figs, lentils, and olives cured in dark oil. The baker's fire had already colored the air with smoke and the smell of fresh bread. Ani moved through the rows, nodding to familiar faces, her basket swinging lightly at her side. Good morning, Ani, called the baker, his hands white with flour. Cold enough for you today? It feels like the sea has turned to ice, she said. 2 loaves, please. He wrapped the bread quickly and passed it to her. How are things going with your husband? I see less and less of him these days. He's been preoccupied preparing the warehouses for the winter storage months. She shuddered and looked around. Although I fear winter has come a little early. Can you believe it's this cold in October? It's not the first time, Mrs. Hagopian, and it won't be the last. She shivered again. I know. I'm just complaining to complain. May I share a thought with you, miss? He asked her. Of course. I would love to hear your thoughts. Well, you of all people know that Bedros served as Belediarisi here for many years. Bedros was Aram's late father. His tenure as Risi lasted 15 years and only ended with his death from pneumonia 4 years ago. He powered on. Ralph Effendi is stepping down. He's sick, they say. I think Adam should take his place. Ani smiled. I'm sure he would appreciate the trust you have in him, but I'm afraid he'd rather run his business and keep his father's legacy intact, being the first Armenian Belediye in Karael. The baker laughed. That's why everyone trusts him. That's what would make him perfect. She thanked him and moved along the stalls. Levon and Zabel rejoined her, cheeks pink from the wind. Levon carried a small fish the size of his hand, its scales glinting in the pale light. One of the men gave it to me, he said. He said it jumped from the net right into the boat. Then I suppose it wanted to meet you, Ani said. We'll cook it for your father tonight. As they walked further into the square, the sound of conversation grew. Women stood in small circles, voices rising and falling over prices and news from the east. Every few minutes, someone mentioned the front lines or the latest rumor from Constantinople, though no one seemed to know which stories were true. Ani! She turned to see Layla, the blacksmith's wife, waving her over from a stall stacked with honey jars and soap. Ani smiled and crossed through the crowd. You're up early, Layla said. You'll have the best of the market before anyone else gets out of bed. If I waited, there'd be nothing left, Ani said. The cold brings out appetites, not patience. Layla laughed softly, then leaned in. Tell me, is it true? The elders are saying your husband might be out to take the Racy's share when Effendi steps down. Ani hesitated. Funny, I just heard something similar from the baker. No one has said anything to us. Aram is happy with his work. Besides, we aren't Muslim. That's what they say makes him right for it, Layla said. His father served, and he doesn't chase power, which means he might use it wisely. Ani smiled but shook her head. He's a merchant, not a politician. The only speeches he makes are to his ledger. Besides, it's only a rumor. Well, I think you should consider it, Layla said. Ani giggled. I'll make sure to tell him. The women stood for a moment in the chill. A cart rolled past carrying sacks marked with the government seal. 2 soldiers walked behind it, their boots clapping against the stones. It'll pass, Layla said quietly. The war, the talk, all of it. It always does. Everything passes eventually, Layla added. She looked down at the children. Come, she said. Let's bring your father his lunch before the bread cools. She had taken the walk along the shores of the strait many times, but today something felt off, ominous. Like everyone else, she remembered the amount of soldiers that had come to the town a few years back during the Balkan War. However, there seemed to be even more this time. Was this war that much bigger? She pulled her shawl tighter and looked out across the water. Small boats moved between the anchored ships, carrying men and supplies to the docks. The sound of boots striking the wooden planks carried far in the still air. From where she stood, she could see the line of warehouses stretching along the quay, their roofs dark with damp. Levant walked ahead, balancing on the edge of the seawall, while Zabel clung to her mother's skirt, skipping to keep pace. Annie called for her son to come down. Not so close to the water, Levant. I'm fine, Mama, he said, dropping down anyway. 5 minutes later, the warehouses loomed large over them. They were the largest buildings in Karael by far. She approached the large sliding doors, left open to the weather as always, and stepped inside. It was cold inside as well. Aram's office was nestled in the back of the warehouse, which, at the moment, was stockpiled with piles of grain, barrels of olives, and other essentials the town merchants would need over the winter. His warehouses were where the townspeople who ran the market stored their wares, and it just so happened that demand always grew in the winter months. A small window looked into his office. Inside, she saw Aram speaking animatedly with 2 men who looked like government officials. One of them wore a sword. She watched the 3 men exchange words for the next 10 minutes. Whatever was going on, it was not good. At least, not for Aram and maybe the town. Finally, the office door opened, and the two officials stepped out. Aram stood at the door, a slight scowl on his face. He turned his head, saw her, and his face lit up. "Annie, my love!" He was always excited to see her even after all these years. "You brought lunch, I see." Annie and the children filed into the small office where Aram kept his desk and small table with 3 chairs. He always stood. She laid the bread on the table and broke pieces off for Aram, the children, and finally for herself. After a few moments of silence, she heard a heavy sigh come from her husband. She knew that sigh. He was upset. "What's wrong?" she asked. "They're taking my warehouse," he answered. "But we knew that already. They did this last time. What has you so upset?" "Annie, they're taking it, not borrowing it." He paused for a moment, running his fingers through his thick, dark hair. "I was told that our location is too important to the military and the government to continue being controlled by a civilian." "What?" she said. "That's outrageous." "I know," he said. He stepped behind his desk and sat, his elbows resting on the open ledgers. For a moment, he simply held his head in his hands. She rose and walked to him, putting her hands on his shoulders, and together they sat in silence. Across the small room, Levon and Zabel took turns tearing pieces of bread off the loaf and devouring it. Annie and the children had gone 3 blocks from their home when she heard a commotion behind her. She quickly shoved Levon into a nearby alcove and entered after him, Zabel still secured to her back. She looked towards their home. From where she stood, she could still see it. Military men had surrounded the house. She watched as one man tried the doorknob. It was open. One by one, they disappeared inside. "Quickly," she said to Levon. She grabbed his hand and led him out of the alcove. Together, they sprinted down the street. 15 minutes later, they were at the edge of town, and there it was, a wagon hitched with 2 horses, just where Hassan had said it would be. "Levon, help me unbundle your sister," she said quietly. He walked behind his mother and took a hold of his sister as she undid the knot which was situated in the front just under her breasts. She felt the weight of Zabel release as he took her. "Lay her in the back of the wagon. You too, get under the blankets." He did as he was told as she situated herself on the bench and took the reins in her hands. She had not driven a wagon since she was 15 years old on her father's farm, just before she met Aram. Tears filled her eyes as she snapped the reins, and the horses drove forward. The night air had been cool. She had been sitting by the window watching the moon cast light onto the waves as they crashed against the shore and the docks just outside when there was a knock at the door. "Who could that be? It's 1 in the morning," she said to herself. Rising, she walked and opened it to see Hassan Demir, a close family friend. He had left with Aram 10 days ago for Constantinople. Aram had been called to a meeting with military officials. Nobody knew why. "Hassan?" She instinctively looked past him for her husband. "Where is Aram?" "May I come in? It's quite urgent." He walked past her before she could answer. "Shut the door, quickly." She did. When she turned, she could see him closing curtains throughout the home. He then sat at the table, in the seat that Aram usually occupied. "What's going on?" she asked. "Where is Aram?" He was quiet. This was unlike him. She and Aram had known Hassan and his family for many years. Hassan was generally very talkative, but not now. She walked to the table and sat across from him. That's when she saw the tears in his eyes. "Hassan, what has happened?" she asked. He was looking at the children now. They had both gone to sleep early, which was normal for Zabel, but not for Levon. Slowly, he turned his head towards her and spoke quietly. "I tried. I swear I tried to save him." "Hassan, you're scaring me." "Tried to save who?" She could no longer hide the panic in her voice. It was no meeting. It was a trial. This took her by surprise. What do you mean? They accused him of treason. They said he used the warehouse to send messages to Russia about troop numbers and movement. They said he was plotting with them to seize Karayel and secure a pathway through the Bosphorus for Russia. But how could that be? She asked. The military took the warehouses a year ago. He was just assigned to help with shipment tracking. He looked up at her with an expression that told her everything before he spoke. In that moment, she understood. The stories that she had heard about Armenian families being rounded up in other towns were not stories at all. They were real. She realized now that the government's takeover of the warehouses and Aram's position there had been part of a larger plan. His work moving goods in and out of Karayel made the accusations believable, not only to the officials, but to their neighbors as well. To them, a man stripped of his livelihood might easily have turned bitter enough to betray his country. And news like that could turn a community against a very well-respected man. The revelation had hit her like a ton of bricks. Where is he now? Prison? He shook his head slowly. Dead? Is Aram dead? She asked in a shriller voice than she intended. To this, he nodded his head. They shot him. She buried her head in her hands and started to cry. She felt him reach across the table and touch her shoulder. There is more. You must cry later, not now. What is it? She asked between her tears. They're coming here, for you and the children. You must leave, and you must leave now. What? Why? We have done nothing. Neither had Aram, and they killed him, he replied. How do you know this? She asked. I was brought home in a military escort. I pretended to sleep on the train. They spoke of the plan. They'll be here at about 2:30. That gives me just over an hour. I can't get too far in that amount of time. My home is being watched. I had to sneak out when the soldier was taking a leak in an alley. This was the soonest I could get to you. But I put our wagon and 2 horses behind the barn near the secondary road out of town heading west. You must get ready. There's not a lot of time. He stood at the table and walked to the door. Don't wait. Go as soon as you can. He opened the door and looked around outside and left quietly, closing the door behind him. She wiped the tears away from her eyes. He was right. There would be plenty of time to grieve later. Now, she had to pack. The nights had become her world. They moved only after the sun fell behind the hills and the wind came down from the strait. The horses knew the rhythm now. Quiet steps, slow breathing, no sounds louder than the creak of the wagon wheels. By day they hid, sometimes in the shell of an abandoned barn, sometimes in a gully beneath the trees, once in the hollow of a hillside where the roots of an olive tree formed a wall against the wind. Levon would gather brush and she would cover the wagon with it until it looked like nothing more than part of the earth. It had been a week since they left Karayel. The town already felt like a place that existed only in memory. Its voices, its bells, its harbor swallowed by distance and silence. At first, she had counted the days. Now, she counted the nights. Zabel was curious and anxious most of the time, wrapped in blankets in the back of the wagon. Levon stayed beside her on the bench. His body leaning against her arm, she could feel how much thinner he had grown. Sometimes he asked if they were close to where Father was waiting. She no longer had the heart to tell him otherwise. The road west was a little more than a trail in places, marked by the faint glimmer of stars reflected in puddles. When the clouds covered the sky, she drove by feel, keeping one hand on the reins and one on the edge of the wagon for balance. The horses were steady, heads bowed as though they too understood the need for silence. She thought often of Hassan. She owed him everything, her life, her children's. But every time she thought of his face, it reminded her of the night he brought her the news. Then she would see Aram again. Aram at the table, his hands folded over ledgers. Aram laughing as Levon tried to mimic his handwriting. Aram promising that the shadow of war would pass. She wanted to believe him still, but the shadows hadn't passed. They had simply learned to move with her. Sometimes, when the road was clear and the night was calm, she would let the horses rest and listen. The world at night was not silent. It whispered. Frogs along a distant creek, wind brushing through the wheat stubble, the faint splash of water somewhere unseen. Every sound made her heart tense, then ease again when no voices followed. She had not lit a fire in 5 nights. Even the faintest glow could betray them. They ate bread gone hard and a little dried fruit that she had taken from the market stall that morning before Hassan arrived. Levon never complained, and that worried her more than the hunger would have. One night, while the moon hid behind clouds, they stopped beside a stream. The horses drank quietly, their breath fogging in the cold. Annie cupped her hands in the water and brought it to her lips. It was bitter and cold, but it was life. She looked up at the stars that had guided them each night. Somewhere beyond them was the world she once knew. Docks, ledgers, laughter, and the smell of bread from the market. Now only the road remained. She reached for Levon's shoulder. "Sleep a little," she whispered. He shook his head. "I'll stay awake with you." She smiled faintly. "Then we'll watch the road together." And so they rode through the night, the woman, her son, and the small sleeping child behind them. 3 shadows passing through a country that no longer wanted to see them. When dawn began to touch the horizon, Annie slowed the horses and guided them towards a dark outline of the forest ahead. The trees would hide them for the day. As the wagon rolled beneath the first branches, she breathed for the first time in hours. They survived another night. The trail led them through a dense wooded area, the canopy hiding all traces of the moon and the stars. Zabel was scared of the dark, and as a result, Levon had put her on the bench between them. It was cozy, but their body heat together protected them from the chilly night air. The wagon bounced over roots and broken branches, which made their rear ends hurt, the most uncomfortable part of the journey so far. Annie still did not know where they were going or what lay ahead. Suddenly, as if curtains had been lifted before them, the world brightened just enough to see. There were no stars, no moon, but the trees thinned and the clouds above reflected a faint gray light from somewhere unseen. The sound of hooves softened against the damp earth. For the first time in hours, she could make out the shapes of land, low hills, tall grass bending with the wind, and in the far distance, the dark shimmer of water. Then, a jolt. The horses disappeared before them, dropping out of sight. The wagon followed, dumping all 3 of them to the ground. The wagon itself barely missed crushing Levon. The horses brayed in pain. She knew then that the horses were lost to them. "Levon, are you okay? Zabel," she yelled into the darkness. "Mama?" It was Zabel. She was crying. She used the sound of her voice to make her way to her. "I have you." "I'm here. I'm okay," added Levon as he too made his way to his sister's side. "Looks like we have to walk now." He sounded older than his years in that moment. "Mother, grab the shawl. Let's put Zabel on your back. I'll help you tie it." He was taking control. At 13, and all she could muster was a quiet, "Okay." With Zabel secured, he led them out of the large hole the horses had led them into, the hole that ushered in the wagon's demise. They walked for an hour. The skies got darker and darker. Rain clouds, she thought to herself. She kept up with Levon only by putting her hand on his shoulder and keeping a hold of his shirt collar. He moved quickly and deftly, like a cat in an alley dodging people. She struggled to keep up. Every few steps, her foot struck something unseen. A branch, a stone, she couldn't tell. The ground was uneven, soft in places, hard in others. Each sound felt too loud, too foreign. Her hand slipped from Levon's shoulder as he lurched forward. "Levon!" she called into the dark, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm fine," he said. "I just tripped over." The night exploded in white, for a moment as if it was the sun had torn through the clouds. Levon was frozen, looking upwards. "A flare," he whispered, and he squinted against the light. "That's odd," she said, though her voice was barely a breath. The light shifted and she saw what lay at her son's feet. A body, a soldier, his uniform torn open, his chest a ruin of blood and mud, the air filled with the smell of decay. Her pulse quickened. She turned in a slow circle. The world around her had changed. The forest was gone. All that remained were craters, torn earth, twisted wire, and the shapes of the dead scattered across the field. Another flare streaked upward from somewhere else, its glow painting the ground in a sickly light. The realization had hit her like a punch in the gut. "We're in a battlefield." The flare slowly dissipated and the sky darkened again. She heard a pop and saw a small light come and go from her right. Then another. Then the gunfire erupted. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, where history comes alive through the lives of those who lived it. If this episode moved you, please share it, follow, and leave a rating. Help keep these stories alive. Want to hold these stories in your hand? Explore the books inspired by them, available now on Kindle and in paperback.